Rick, happy Monday to you. Thank you for joining ZenOne Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on, Tiger. I really look forward to talking to your audience.
All right, let's start with an introduction. I really hope I don't butcher it because it's really outside of my typical conversation. So we're going to talk about the tariffs. And I really wanted to bring you because you're a partner at Barnes, Richardson, and Colburn, which is a global trade law firm that has been around since 1990. And
Yes.
you, on top of it, serve on the board of Dental Trade Alliance. And then when we talked about what's the best way to introduce you, you said that you represent the companies that make the stuff that professionals are actually using. So
Yes, exactly.
I didn't
Well,
butcher it.
no, not too bad. Just as I said, I'm not on the quote unquote board of the Dental Trade Alliance. I am an attorney that the Dental Trade Alliance hires to provide to it, the alliance, as well as its members, advice and guidance on federal regulatory matters. And in that capacity, tariffs are a huge issue for the manufacturing and distributing end of the dental industry.
Okay, so let's jump in. April 9th, what happened?
Well, we probably should jump in a little sooner than that. You need just a little bit more of a baseline before we get to April 9th. Um, Obviously, we have a history of using tariffs. Frankly, the Tariff Act, I think, the third or fourth act of Congress back in 1789. So our country has always had tariffs. It's just been more recently where they have been used in a more aggressive manner. And we need to start basically with Trump 1.0, because that's when he first rolled out what we call the China 301 tariffs. When I refer to China 301, 301 is a section of law that the president used to assess additional tariffs on products that were made in China. And those tariffs initially were at 25% for some products, 7.5% for other products. Some products, including Tiger's certain dental products, were not assessed at all with the China 301 tariffs. These tariffs survived the first Trump administration. During the Biden administration, they survived as well. And in fact, some of them were ratcheted up to even higher numbers. So, for example, electric vehicles from China now have a 100% tariff on them. And gloves and syringes and some other products that impact dentistry also have higher tariff rates in the 50% range. So that was what we call the China 301 tariffs, and they survive to this day. And they only apply on products that are made in China. Now we can fast forward to the second Trump administration. And the first thing he did was he came out and he said he was going to assess special tariffs on China, on Canada, and Mexico. And we call these the IEPA tariffs. And IEPA is an acronym, and it stands for the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. And it's a body of law that the president is using as the basis for assessing these special tariffs. And just as a sort of an aside, the Constitution places the right to lay and collect duties with the legislative branch of government, not the executive branch. However, there have been a number of times over our country's history where the legislative branch has delegated to the executive branch the legal authority to take certain steps to basically protect U.S. interests. And one of those steps includes using tariffs as a tool to try to remedy what we perceive to be some sort of bad action or bad activity created by a foreign party. So Section 301 is one of those delegated statutes. IEPA is another one of those delegated statutes. And under the IEPA, back in February, the president announced he was going to issue an additional 10% tariff on products, again, from China, only China at this time. And at the same time, he also said he was going to assess a 10% IEPA tariff on products that originate in Canada and or Mexico. And when that happened, started getting lots of calls from DTA members because there's a tremendous amount of cross-border transaction in the dental industry. There was clearly a big uptick when the president announced these IEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico. That was February. Then in March, he raised those tariffs to against China. And maybe I didn't say this, but the IEPA tariffs put in against Mexico and Canada were set at 25%. So beginning of March, now we have 20% additional IEPA tariff on Chinese origin product and a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican product. He then said, okay, certain Mexican and Canadian originating products would not be subject to the tariff. And those products are ones that qualify under the free trade agreement that President Trump had renegotiated back in his first term. I'm sure you'll remember the old acronym NAFTA. Well, back in Trump's first administration, the NAFTA was scuttled, and in its place was a new free trade agreement among the three North American countries, and that we basically call it the United States Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, or by its acronym USMCA. So if the product was made in Canada or made in Mexico, but qualified under the terms of the USMCA, then the product was not subject to 25% Canadian IEPA duties. There was a lull before those were even put into place, but basically rolling into April, that was the structure. And then came April 3rd, I believe, is when the announcement first went out that he was going to be assessing what we call reciprocal tariffs. And these reciprocal tariffs were loosely based on one of his campaign pledges, where he was going to assess a baseline tariff against products regardless of where they were made. Because again, keep in mind, so far, the only products that are subject to these heightened, we'll just call them the heightened Trump tariffs, were the products from China, which now had not only the 20% IEPA tariffs from 2025, but they had those legacy China 301 tariffs, which typically were 7.5% or 25%. So China was a problem for tariffs, and then now Mexico and Canada. Reciprocal tariffs roll around, and he announces with great fanfare, I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with this, but he announced a baseline tariff of 10% on all products, regardless of origin. And then he also announced that on April 9th, which now we're circling back to your April 9th question, Tiger, was on April 9th, 59 countries, and then the EU, because he lumped all the EU countries in as one. So we have like 60 sovereign entities. We're going to have their tariffs raised to specific country rates. And those rates vary depending on the particular country or in this case, the EU. So the EU's rates were to go up from 10% to 20%. China's originally was scheduled to go from 10% to 34%. Vietnam was going to go to, I think it was 46%. Cambodia, I think, was going to go to 49%. In any event, there were 60 specific country rates, and those were to kick in on the 9th of April. So you would graduate from 10% to one of these higher rates if you were one of these 64 countries. So April 9th rolls around, 12:01 April 9th, this happens. 13 hours later, sometime around noon on the 9th of April, the president came out and he paused these heightened tariffs. He rolled them back to 10%, with the exception of China. China we had to sort of stick on the side because they're getting special treatment. But as of like 12:01 on April 10th, everything had reverted back so that all countries, with a few exceptions, China being the most notable, and Mexico and Canada also being notable because they already were being treated separately. But the rest of the world rolled back to 10% on a 90-day pause. That 90-day pause is set to sunset on the July 9th, I believe it is. And that would make sense. 90 days from April 9th would be July 9th. And so the thinking was that during this time period, the countries could come and try to negotiate some sort of relief from these, I guess, now anticipated heightened tariff rates. So, we're more than 30 days into the pause period. We haven't had any trade agreements announced. There have been rumblings and promises, and I don't know if you read the president's Time magazine article, but he's basically talking about having 200 all lined up and ready to go. We'll wait and see if those come about or not. But in other words, as of right now, when we're talking about country-specific tariffs, so those of basically products made in any country in the world, it's got a baseline tariff of 10%, which is on top of any tariff that may have existed prior to that has existed and exists today based on what we call most favored nation tariff rates. So again, if we could just sort of wipe the slate clean of everything that President Trump has done in both his terms tariff-wise, we would still have baseline tariffs for most products. There are smaller tariffs. Some could be more than 10%, but I'd say the vast majority are much less. And a great number of products were free of duty. And again, so there were lots of dental products that were never subjected to a most favored nation duty rate. And if they were made in China up until this year, were not subject to a China 301 rate. So now all of a sudden, those products, if they're coming from China, are looking at 45% tariff rate. And you get to that 145% by taking the 20% from that China IEPA tariff that I talked about that went into effect in February and March, and add that to what is now the China reciprocal rate. Now, I said on this, a few minutes ago that like when April 9th, when the reciprocals were first announced, China rate was at 34%. Now, what happened? We announced China was going to get a 34% tariff. The Chinese said, okay, what's good for you is good for us, so we're going to put a 34% tariff on all U.S. origin product. So then President Trump upped the ante, tacked on 50% on top of that to raise it from 34% to 84%, and then the Chinese matched it. And then President Trump came out and he raised it to 125%, and the Chinese matched it. So this is where it topped off. But right now, that's what the reciprocal tariff is for goods coming from China. And so again,
what's the current rate with China? 44, 154?
Well, it's 125% for the reciprocal tariff. It's plus 20% for the IEPA, the IEPA tariff. And then it can be even more if you had legacy
China 301
and a legacy regular tariff. So for example, here, let me see if I can pull out an example that would be of interest here. So dental imaging devices, okay, historically had been duty free. There had been no most favored nation tariff rate on that. So prior to the first Trump administration, those products were coming into the country duty free. Dental imaging devices were then hit with a 25% China 301 tariff. And now they get to add 25% to 145% because it's Chinese origin. So they're going to pay the China 301, the China IEPA, and the China reciprocal, and that gets you to 170%. So a dental imaging device that was imported in 2015 with no duty is now being imported at 170% duty.
Okay, so let's just, for the simplicity, let's take a widget, $1,000. We then multiply by 170%. That's $1,700.
Okay.
So $700 on top of it, just in the last 3 months.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's
what
I mean. Yes, I'll trust your math.
Right. I use the calculator. I don't trust my math that much. So the point is, first of all, it's been going on, right? It's not. So I just want to make it clear for everybody, and I'm really trying to make it non-political. People can go to different places to get their political take on this. I'm just trying to break it down and use your expertise and knowledge, like in the dentistry, right? So what would that look like for an average private practice owner? So pretty much they were exempt from most of the dental products in China 301, like you said, syringes and some other stuff. I think one of the key things that I wanted to ask, implants and anesthetics, like a lot of them are imported from France, Italy, and Canada. And implants are primarily like from Germany and some, I think, other places, but it's like Europe. So
Okay.
what's the current story on that?
Okay, let's just start with stuff coming from any of the European nations.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd have to pay if there's a regular most favored nation rate, and I don't know off the top of my head for implants. I think it was free, but I had to double check that. But you'd pay that plus you would pay the existing reciprocal tariff associated with EU merchandise. And that right now, as of today, is 10% because the 20% that it had been pegged at has been paused until July 9th. So between now and July 9th, it's 10%. Now that July 9th, I don't know if there's anything etched in stone about it. It could get extended, or between now and then there might be some sort of political resolution which could have an impact on that. But yes, today if you're importing something from Germany, the reciprocal rate is only 10%, and that's the same way it is for every country except for China, which is at 125% plus all the other ones we talked about, and Canada and Mexico because they have their own unique tariffs. Okay, and just to really complicate things a little further, Tiger, there have been a few tariffs that have been rolled out this year having to do with aluminum and steel. And we're talking mostly like unwrought bulk aluminum and steel, but there are certain derivative products made from aluminum and steel, typically not finished products, but stuff that might be like steel shapes and things like that, which have their own unique 25% tariff. Auto parts and autos now have a unique 25% tariff. Now, those 25% tariffs, which again, to further complicate this by bringing in the legal statutes that these tariffs are based on, those are based on what we call Section 232 of a different trade act. So I've talked about Section 301, I've talked about IEPA, now 232. And 232s are, if you're subject to a 232, so if you're in those classifications I just mentioned, then you're not subject to the reciprocal tariffs. So those are carve outs. So if you're already getting whacked with 25% because you're steel or because you're an imported automobile, you're not also going to get whacked with the additional 10% because it came from a particular country. That's the status right now. Now these 232s are a growing vehicle for the president. He has started 232 investigations into copper, into lumber, into pharmaceutical products and ingredients, and
Isn't
electronics.
iPhone there too? Isn't iPhone there too?
Yes, electronics and semiconductors, and most recently a 232 on critical metals. Now, those will take a while to develop. They're using 232. It's a more structured, more public notice driven means of assessing the tariffs. Whereas when the president uses the IEPA, it's basically the president making a decision and implementing it on his own without getting feedback from the citizenry. And for that reason, IEPA tariffs are currently being challenged in court. And whereas in the past, the use of the 232 tariffs has been reviewed by the courts and found to be an appropriate vehicle for the president to use, and the Section 1s are currently undergoing judicial scrutiny, but at the trial level, the use was upheld. And right now we're waiting, and it could be any day now, for the Court of Appeals to issue their decision on this. But in any event, 232s and the 301s have had a day in court and have been reviewed, and in the case of the 232s, been affirmed, whereas the IEPA is all, new stuff, and we'll have to see what happens. So if the IEPA is found to be an improper vehicle for assessing tariffs, then it could very well be that these could go away immediately with a court order. But that's basically the current status of stuff coming from the EU. It would be 10%. From the rest of the world, it would be 10%. From China, it would be at least 145%. From Canada and Mexico, it would either be free because it qualified under the free trade agreement, or it will be 25%. You may have heard like Russia didn't get a rate. Russia didn't get a rate because they already had a really bad rate. We talked about most favored nation rates. There's also something for much higher rates for countries that are not given most favored nation status, and that includes Russia and Iran and Cuba and North Korea, maybe Syria, I forget, but there are like a handful of countries that don't have most favored, and because they already had rates that were in excess of 30%, they didn't get a specific country rate. So if people are saying, "Oh, he was soft on those countries," well, they have been treated. They've had a higher rate now for a while.
Right. Okay, so if I'm a dentist just about to walk into the treatment room to see the patient,
Yeah.
and I heard this podcast, you clearly you can stuff. Like that's so cool. Like you can go and say, this is China 301. I had no clue about the IEPA. I had no clue about. I heard a little bit about Section 232 because it's probably like what's going on right now and we're paying attention to. But as a dentist, like what would you say if we talk about mitigation? Should I look at my past invoices for the last month and say, all right, I'm just going to throw a 10% extra to budget it next month, 25%? What's going to be the safe rate for me to go into April, May to budget things?
So dentists are most likely not the importer. They're most likely buying from a distributor or from an importer. So think in terms of what's going to happen to the payment of that tariff by the importer. Just to get crystal clear here, and not to be political, but again, the importer pays the duties. The foreign countries and the foreign exporters don't pay it. The U.S. importer pays that. So now you're a U.S. company, you're paying 170% extra now to get your dental imaging device into the country. What are you going to do? So what can you do? You can go back to your foreign vendor, right, and say, this is unsustainable. We can't continue doing business. You need to lower your price. Well, that's one option. The second thing you can do is you can say, okay, we're going to bite the bullet. We don't want to raise our prices. We don't want our vendors to get mad at us. So we are going to basically absorb the cost of the tariff. And what might that mean? That might mean that the company is not going to be able to expand, because their working capital is going to be going towards paying for tariffs rather than maybe, growing their physical plant or hiring new people or giving raises or, paying off debt or buying new equipment, whatever companies do. So then the third option, which is the one I think we as consumers will definitely see, is some or all of this is going to be pushed down the supply chain and eventually get wrapped up in the cost that gets transferred to the consumer. And so when we think of dentistry, when we think of a dentist, so a dentist is, using certain things, they're buying hand tools, they're getting, as you say, all sorts of dental products that they're using that they price into the cost of their services. Like you go to the dentist, they're not saying, well, we're going to hit you a surcharge because we're using these hand tools on you, but they have to factor that into the cost of their business. And then they're going to take
Can I push back on that? Can I push back a little bit on this?
Sure.
So I think where my problem with this is most dentists are in network with insurance companies.
Okay.
And they get reimbursed by insurance. And I have a hard time imagining Delta Dental, I don't want to pick on them, but I'll pick, saying, because of the tariffs, we're going to increase their reimbursement rate.
Well, that's certainly a huge problem that you're going to be facing. But again, we're just trying to sort of explain how these things are going to be handled. They're going to get pushed out as best they can. You asked about people putting surcharges on their invoices. I mean, that's all possible. I'm sure you heard that Amazon, there was some rumor floating around that Amazon was going to do that. And there was pushback, and they didn't want Amazon to show this as the tariffs. Well, we're all savvy enough consumers that when we get a bill for twice what we think it should be, it's like, well, why is it that? And then there's really only one explanation. I think people will intuitively get to that. But so the dentists, let's look at this with the insurance issue. If in fact reimbursement is going to be pegged to a certain level, so more likely the dentists are going to find themselves probably in the middle bucket. Because, I don't know, maybe they can push back with their distributors. Maybe they can negotiate better pricing. Of course, the distributors are looking to push the tariffs down. Yeah, I don't think that the dental insurance companies are going to be out there saying, we feel badly for you, so we're going to raise the reimbursement rate by
Right.
X percent. So yeah, so the dental practices are going to be probably left holding the bag for the most part. And again, there you're looking at using their working capital to pay for their operations.
That's where I
So
feel really bad. Like
yeah,
typically, the private practices they're not the ones who have the most smooth operated machine, like a well-oiled machine. They're the ones who have struggles, right? They're the ones who are a little bit behind on collecting reimbursements from insurance companies. They have maybe too much staff. Then maybe they're paying too much for supplies. And then all of a sudden now, I just saw last week the X-ray handheld device on Zen went from $2,600 to $3,500, like just in one night, right? And we're tracking prices, we're tracking the differences internally, we're trying to pick them up, and so that's where I'm trying to figure out the mitigation, and waiting maybe is an option as well, but we just don't know. Right. Or like, I'm really curious how the Canada is going to turn out, because we do export a lot of stuff in dentistry from Canada.
Yeah, so hopefully that stuff that's going back and forth across the Canadian border, across the Mexican border, is qualifying for U.S. free trade agreement, the USMCA free trade. And in that case, it would be exempt from all duties, both the special 25% duty as well as any of that regular most favored nation duty. If you qualify, you're not subject to either. But yes, it's going to be interesting. I don't know how actively the dentists are pricing their goods, what they're purchasing. I don't know how much clout they have to push back and say, we're not interested in paying these charges. Because again, they're going to be talking to most likely the company that absorbed the cost immediately. I will say people should be mindful that if you are getting invoices which have a surcharge on them, think of it this way. The tariff is associated with the price that's declared when the goods come into the country. That's typically the price that the foreign vendor is selling the goods at to the U.S. importer, which is probably a distributor. So that U.S. importer / distributor is going to take that product, and then they're going to mark it up for their profit and cover their overhead, and they're going to sell it to the dentist. So if the invoice that the dentist get has a surcharge associated with it, which is for some crazy amount, like we keep going back to this 170% on dental imaging devices. Well, remember that 170% was not charged on that price. It was on the lower import price. But we've already bumped heads with companies kind of using this as a vehicle to raise their prices by just saying, okay, everybody, there's a 10% reciprocal tariff on all products, so we'll just raise our price by 10%. When in fact, the difference between what they paid for it, what they're selling it, might be 100% difference from what they paid for it to what they're selling it. And so that's going to have an impact if you're assessing 10% on $50 or 10% on $100.
Right. Yeah, and I think on top of it, I don't want to call it a game, but I feel there's going to be something around larger distributors stocking up their warehouses ahead of time versus smaller distributors. So like somebody having thousands of pallets of gloves from Malaysia, right, and X-ray devices from China versus somebody with just 100 pallets or 10 pallets. And they're going to sell out their stuff first, like sooner. And then they're going to get hit with, because I believe everything before April 9th is not affected by, as long as it was in the ship and left the docket.
Yeah, there's a formula. So there's definitely product that was brought into the United States with the expectation that there would be tariffs. There were definitely companies out there that were looking to front load their warehouses. And then I think there's probably companies now saying, hey, we're at a 10% pause. And worst case is in a couple of months, we could be looking at, a higher rate. Let's say if it's coming from India, that's 26%. So you have companies out there that I'm sure are also trying to, raise the tariff and to front load their warehouses. And so if you have the, economic clout to do that, well, you'll benefit because you'll be getting it in at a lower or most likely lower tariff rate. And then, of course, you can continue to sell with pricing that reflects that lower tariff rate. As you said, Tiger, if you're a smaller person who keeps a smaller inventory, you're going to run out of the inventory. You're going to need to resupply that inventory. And if you do that, the new inventory is going to show the tariffs. And the other thing to keep in mind is, a lot of companies that are importers are now holding off placing orders, especially if those companies involved in the China trade, simply hoping there'll be some sort of negotiated settlement. But even you push that off for a couple of months, think of what that's going to do to the supply chain once inventory here in the United States gets used up.
Yeah.
Heard people talk about there's going to be, empty shelves, but it will be no different than for the dentists who may have a harder time getting the things that they need to run their practices that are disposable and need to be replaced.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast over the weekend that I don't remember the exact percentage. That's why I don't even want to bring it up. But there was definitely a decrease in bookings in ships from China over here. There's that. So I don't even know where to go. Like we talked a little bit of mitigation, but there's not much I think the dentist can do unless just get more efficient, use less stuff, and make sure they don't rely on maybe one vendor, but use multiple vendors in price shop, because somebody may have this product brought in before the tariffs and they might be selling it at the cheaper rate. That wouldn't last, I assume, for too long. Like I think everybody's going to run out of inventory in the next, let's just say 6 months, hypothetically, but within 6 months, they can operate in that direction.
Yeah, that's probably a sound piece of advice. There's better mitigating that can be done at the importer level because they're the first folks to, they're the ones who are placing the orders. So that there are certain strategies that might be available to them that might help them decrease the amount of duties that they have to pay. You might start seeing more companies fleeing the China market, China trade, and moving elsewhere. I mean, even if like Vietnam were to go to 46%, that's still a whole lot better than 145% for China.
Or India, 26%, as you mentioned.
So yeah, exactly. So you might start seeing some migration that way. Will there be migration back to the United States, which I know is the administration's ultimate goal? I don't know. I don't, again, I think one of the things that's always going to be difficult about, recapturing lost industry is, labor is cheaper elsewhere. And, even if you are charging, additional 20%, 30%, your labor rates probably offset that easily. And it may be that it's just, yes, it makes it less profitable, but still something that they're going to continue doing. But it's possible that you could start seeing some of this come back to the United States.
Yeah, but that might take years. So,
anything, yes, obviously anything that's manufactured is going to take years because you just can't really, for the most part, uplift a factory and move it across from one sovereign nation to another.
Yeah. Rick, I guess one maybe even closing question. If somebody wants to learn about tariffs and I know it's going to be loaded. Just go chat GPT and ask, probably the best. But like without going one way news or the other way news, like just to again, I just can't think of a different way. Like if I'm a dentist, I'm driving to work and I'm thinking, all right, what's going on today? Or what's my strategy? How am I going to build my procurement or ordering strategy for the next month? Is there a place that you could recommend and say, okay, this is going to be just what you discover, like you discussed? You said, this has happened, these are the tariffs, and this is what's going on right now. Is there a place? Like, do you guys put out anything on your website to update people?
Well, we have a newsletter that we circulate at a minimum every Tuesday, but when we have interesting things that are, breaking news, we would circulate them immediately. So, there are lots of places that are putting out information about the tariffs and stuff, and certainly we would be one resource. But, you have the logistics the freight logistics companies that put this information out. You have other law firms, customs brokerages, they tend to monitor all this. And, it obviously is also of national interest that the national news sources are covering it to get it in one nice lump place, that again, there are lots of entities out there. If you were to do a internet search, you'd probably be able to find that. So the one thing I will tell all your listeners, however, is if you do rely on a third party's posting on their website or in a newsletter, look to see the date, because this is so fluid. I tell you, every time I do a presentation on a PowerPoint, it's like always, here's the situation as of this particular date. I guess I should give the caveat that everything I've said today is good as of May 5th, 2025. It could be all totally different tomorrow. And if it is different tomorrow, I hope it's different in a way that benefits everyone.
Right. Right. I would put that in the title as well, is that it's an update as of May 5th. All right. Any departing thoughts on this?
Well, for the dentists out there, I would think that if you are looking for strategies, it would be trying to figure out how long you can hold out, because things are fluid. And I do believe that you will start seeing some movement. There will be some negotiated settlements. I just don't know what that means. I don't know if we negotiate a settlement with, like, say, Japan. I bring up Japan because it's a country that has been involved in talks with the United States already. So right now, Japan's at 10%. They were targeted to go to 24%. And there are definitely some trade barriers the Japanese have erected that deter U.S. entities from shipping there. Rice being one of the big examples, where they have a high tariff because they're not looking to have their market flooded with non-Japanese rice. If there's some sort of negotiated settlement where Japan concedes some stuff and we concede some stuff, what does that mean? Now, does that mean that Japan doesn't get a 24% reciprocal tariff? It just stays at 10%? Does it mean that it gets no reciprocal tariff? Does it mean that, well, maybe it gets more than 10 but less than 24? That's the hard part. But I would think for the dentists out there, if you could hold off, well, either A, buy immediately, because you probably haven't seen the prices really kick in yet because we are on a pause, with the exception of the Chinese stuff. But otherwise, you keep in mind that come July, these numbers could go up radically. But likewise, come July, if you can, hold out, it may be that these numbers get reduced. So, I'm hoping that everyone out there's crystal ball is at least
as
less
crystal as
hazy
yours.
than mine. Yeah, or not as hazy as mine.
Yeah. Well, Rick, thank you so much. I think this was a lot of great information, definitely clarified for me on a lot of things. And I'm glad that we use some of the real examples. Do you mind if anything breaking happens, I bring you back and we talk about it?
No, if your audience demands more tariff, we can give them more tariff.
Okay, well, thanks, Rick. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Tiger. Nice meeting you.
Yeah, same here. I'll link up in the details on how people can sign up for the newsletter if they're interested to get every Tuesday the newsletter from you guys.
Great, thanks.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Rick.
Right.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye now.